Chemical weapons and red lines crossed. Is the Syrian war heading to a dangerous escalation? Anti-Semitism on the rise in Europe, and Jews are heading to Israel. Free speech under attack in America. It's more than just Facebook censoring of Diamond and Silk. These stories and more. And it's all right here, right now from the Global Lane. Joining us is American University Paris professor Hall Gardner. He's author of the book World War Trump. Dr. Gardner, thanks for being with us today. All eyes, of course, are on Syria. Civilian air traffic over the country has been cleared for a military air attack. So what do you think may happen?
Well, I'm hopeful if Trump does anything, it'll be somewhat even more limited than what he did last time. But that doesn't seem to be what's in the works. Let me just backtrack. Trump himself had opposed Obama's strikes, possibility of Obama striking in 2013. Then when he was confronted with similar attacks, chemical attacks, sarin gas at the time, he went ahead and struck with 59 cruise missiles but a very limited effect. And these present attacks are not sarin gas. They appear to be chlorine gas, which Assad has been using periodically in these horrible barrel bombs that his forces have been using on the civilian population for quite a while now. So irony of this is it's not entirely new, but yet the media and international pressures are pushing the United States again into action.
Do we know for certain that this was the Assad regime that did this chemical attack?
No, and we didn't know the previous attacks. There's still questions about the previous attacks that Trump fired 59 cruise missiles against. These things really need a UN investigation and a force that can move in quickly. The peacekeepers are not an interventionary force, but a people that can move in quickly to examine these areas. And this has been very difficult because many of these areas are actually controlled by al-Nusra or radical elements. So even getting people there to investigate is difficult. I just say you can't accuse Assad without absolute proof, but we do know that he's been using barrel bombs for quite a while.
Well, I mean, this if we don't have proof, this thing could spiral into a big war because the Russians, of course, Vladimir Putin is threatening to respond by attacking wherever the missiles are launched from. I mean, what if he hits one of our ships, that kind of thing?
Well, that's exactly right. And that's the escalation of tensions. What happens, and that's why we're in a very dangerous situation. It's not just here in Syria, it's China, Taiwan, North Korea, South Korea, and some other places where everybody's drawing red lines. And as soon as one side crosses the red lines, that forces the other side to respond, or one side to respond because they crossed the red line. So right now, the United States says Russia's crossed the red line or Syria's crossed the red line again, and this could force the Russians to then respond to protect the Syrians. Otherwise, they seem too weak. So Trump's done it once. He got away with it. Russia didn't react. But it's not clear to me they won't react a second time.
Okay, now 1 year ago when Trump did act unilaterally, he launched 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles on Syria. This time, it looks like he's trying to bring in some of our allies, Britain and France. What do you think of that strategy? Should he act multilaterally?
Well, I actually think that's even more dangerous because that implies that Britain, France, and in fact, NATO itself is involved in this action in getting NATO, well, even though it won't be official NATO response, it will look like that to the Russians. And this will cause the Russians to create a bigger buildup against the alliance.
So is Putin bluffing or is he serious this time?
That's what I'm saying. He can't be shown as weak too often. That's the problem. We're putting Putin in the spot here, and it's very difficult to tell how he'll react. He could react in some other part of the world. Now remember, he's blaming the Saudis, or the Russians are attacking U.S. Support for Saudi Arabia in Yemen, and in many ways that's an even worse crisis in terms of humanitarian situation there than Syria. Though it's horrible to try to compare two conflicts like that. And so this is seen as a very Western hypocrisy, particularly if the British, French, and the Americans all align together. And it will also, by the way, push Russia and China even closer together. And that's what my book, World War Trump, is primarily concerned with, because if we're pushing Russia and China into a closer alliance, they could react separately at different times, but tacitly support one another.
Okay, Dr. Hall Gardner of American University in Paris, and author of the book World War Trump. Thanks so much for your insights today.
Thank you very much for interviewing me. It was excellent. Thank you.
One of the important stories of our time is the return of Jews to the nation of Israel. And joining me now is Alan Hoffman. He's Director General of the Jewish Agency, the largest Jewish nonprofit organization in the world, and one which is helping Jews come to Israel. So, right. Alan, thank you for being with us. So where are most of the Jews coming from that are coming to Israel?
It's a pleasure to be here, first of all. And, you know, the Jewish Agency has brought 4 million Jews to Israel since the state was created. And in every period, there are different groups of Jews who need to be brought to Israel or who wish to be brought to Israel. So whereas in the early years of the state, we brought 120,000 Jews from Iraq and several 100,000 Jews from Morocco and many of the countries of North Africa. In the last 25 years, the Jewish Agency brought 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union. And even today, close to 16,000 Jews come from Russia and from the Ukraine. More and more what we're seeing is young professionals who believe that there's no future under Mr. Putin, or who come from the eastern parts of the Ukraine where there's still fighting and conflict, also related to Russia. And so we have an ongoing stream of close to 15,000 Jews who come from Russia and from the Ukraine and from the former Soviet Union altogether. More recently, in the last 5 or 6 years, there's been a very strong stream of Jews coming from Europe, particularly from France, after a wave of anti-Semitic incidents, terrible terrorist attack in Toulouse at a Jewish school. The following year, 2015 and 2016, we saw close to 8,000 French Jews coming to Israel. That's 8,000 Jews out of a total population of 500,000. In 1 year, that's a very big percentage.
And there have been more attacks just recently in France. In Paris, we saw an elderly woman who survived the Holocaust. I think she was 85 years old. She was brutally murdered.
Brutally murdered.
Yeah.
So I should say that after the Bataclan attack, which is almost 2 years ago on the nightclub in Paris, the French government responded by bringing army into Jewish institutions. And I think for about a year there was a sense of security, and the immigration went down a bit from 8,000 a year to about 6,000 a year. But one of the things that we're noticing, particularly in the last couple of weeks, and this is true about Europe in general, there's concern in Hungary, there's concern in France, there is a concern of a new and very ugly wave of anti-Semitism sweeping Western Europe, and I think that we will see more Jews coming to Israel.
Well, what kind of stories are you hearing from those who do come to Israel from Europe?
I think that not everybody realizes that when Jews left North Africa, Algeria is a good example, or Tunisia, at the same time, there were many Muslims who were leaving at the same time. And these Jews and Muslims moved to France and moved into these new neighborhoods that the French government were building, and lived very peacefully, cheek by jowl, for a long time. But as many of the Muslim populations have become radicalized, it has become much, much more difficult for Jews to actually live in France in this situation where their neighbor may be somebody who is becoming increasingly anti-Semitic and increasingly radicalized. I think you may know that in France, the rabbis of France actually made a rabbinic decision that French Jews do not have to wear the head covering in order not to be identified in the public transportation. That is quite something for a country that gave the world the French Revolution and the values of the French Revolution. And Jews today feel uncomfortable wearing a religious head covering in public areas in France.
Well, that's limiting their free speech, is it not?
It's limiting their free speech. It's limiting their free speech. I think that we hear of Jewish children being taunted in public schools. There's a big push of families who would like to get places that don't exist in Jewish schools. And so families say, if this is what the future is going to look like, I don't think that this is what I'd like to see for my children. And we see many, many young people making a decision to leave. The biggest assets for the State of Israel is the support of Christians around the world who believe in Israel and believe in the fulfillment of the biblical prophecy.
Okay, thank you, sir, from the Jewish Agency for joining us today.
Thank you.
God bless you. Everywhere we turn, it seems there's someone trying to limit our speech. On college campuses and mainstream and social media, sometimes censorship prevails. Our speech is labeled homophobic, Islamophobic, divisive, and offensive. Nearly 3/4 of Americans polled say political correctness is silencing discussion about important societal matters. And more than half say they're afraid to share their views. Nadine Strossen is professor of constitutional law at New York Law School, the first woman national president of the American Civil Liberties Union, where she served from 1991 through 2008. Her new book is out next month. It's called Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. So, Nadine, thank you for joining us today. Social media is being turned into an emotional wound for many people. What do you think?
Gary, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. And this should be an issue that is of special concern to your audience members because, sadly, among the expression that is demonized as so-called hate speech, and I will explain in a moment why I put air quotes around that term, religious speech, especially traditional Christian beliefs, have repeatedly been assailed as allegedly expressing hateful views against certain groups of people. But the term has no agreed upon legal meaning. The Supreme Court has never identified and defined a category of speech based on its message and said that message is so hateful or hated that it is not going to be constitutionally protected. To the contrary, the Supreme Court has famously, across the vast ideological spectrum of justices, agreed that the bedrock of our free speech jurisprudence is what the court calls viewpoint neutrality, that regardless of the viewpoint, even if it might be considered hateful and even if it is hated, that is never a justification for suppressing it.
Well, I know that a recent poll showed that some college students are fearful that they're losing their speech rights on campus. But then in turn, they also showed, well, maybe we should limit hate speech. Why do you think they're thinking that way these days?
Well, and I do have to say I'm very disturbed by those polls, Gary, but I don't want to unfairly single out college students or today's college students, because in truth, anytime you take a poll of any segment of the public, there is dismayingly lack of understanding about basic free speech principles. And in particular, everybody thinks that it's just common sense that if they hate a particular idea, that's the one idea that should be subject to censorship, right? So many years ago, a wonderful journalist named Nat Hentoff wrote a book whose title says it very well: freedom of speech for me, but not for thee, how the left and right in America relentlessly censor each other.
Well, I know as a distinguished law professor, I'm sure you have some insights on the best way to educate people about free speech, expressing themselves without crossing too many lines. So what approach do we need to embrace?
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, because that is exactly why I wrote the book, and in the hope that I would have the chance to speak to people such as you and members of your audience to persuade people that no matter who we are and no matter what we believe, we depend on a robust freedom of speech in order not only to be able to discuss and present our own ideas, but also in order to be able to advocate for causes or organizations that we believe are important in order to participate effectively as citizens in a democratic country. After all, so many of the topics and ideas that have been demonized and sought to be suppressed as so-called hate speech are at the core of very important public policy issues. One person's hate speech is somebody else's cherished, loving speech, right? We are such a wonderfully diverse society with many different views and values about what is right and true and good and just. So not surprisingly, we can't possibly arrive at a consensus, nor should we arrive at a consensus about what ideas are sufficiently hated or hateful that they should be suppressed. That decision should not be up to a majority. You know, one case that is sadly all too typical, a California high school treated as hate speech that could be punished a T-shirt that a student wore to school quoting a Bible verse, the thrust of which, I'm sure you know the verse, that homosexuality is sinful. Now, he was a devout Christian. He obviously believed that trying to persuade individuals not to engage in same-sex sexual conduct would save their souls. I don't accept that belief myself. I'm not a Christian, but I certainly defend his right to hold that belief and to express that belief. And I would certainly never describe his sharing that belief as hateful. It was the opposite.
Now, many governments around the world censor news and speech. They say it works well. Like China says, other nations should follow their lead on internet censorship. What do you think about that? Should the United States follow the Chinese example?
Absolutely not. And that's why there are so many people who are leaving China or trying to leave China for the United States, also while they are still in China, trying their best to thwart the government's censorial efforts. And this is especially important for anybody who challenges the status quo. It's completely incompatible with the concept of democracy that is the basis on which this country was founded. Now, the internet is such an interesting example, Gary, because lately we've been hearing a lot of complaints, well-justified complaints, about unfortunate kinds of expression for which the internet is being used, manipulating American elections, hate speech, fake news, and so forth. But I continue to believe what the Supreme Court has said since the mid-20th century, that the best response to speech that we dislike or find to be dangerous for any reason is not censorship, but more speech. Expose the lies, give true information, allow people to refute hate mongers, to support those that they disparage, and certainly strongly enforce laws that criminalize any actual discriminatory conduct and violence, but do not outlaw ideas. It just doesn't work.
Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos recently said meaningful education in America should include the message of God. But many college students today seem to be mostly concerned about rising tuition costs. Wall Street Journal reports the average annual tuition for a four-year public college or university is now almost $6,600. That's up from about $4,800 in 2008. Some people argue college is now just a waste of time and money. Joining us with more is Bryan Caplan. He's a professor of economics at George Mason University, author of the new book, The Case Against Education: Why the Education System is a Waste of Time and Money. So, Mr. Caplan, in your opinion, why is college a waste of time and money?
Well, I notice I say the education system is a waste rather than the education itself. This is an important distinction because I say there's a big difference between what education does for the individual, which is get them more money and better jobs, versus what it does for society, where I say it mostly is just a way for people to spend time learning a bunch of subjects they're never going to use again. And again, really the heart of my book is to try to understand how can it be that employers care so much about your grades and performance in classes that you're never going to use again. And my answer is that a lot of what school does is it's a way to jump through hoops to impress employers. So basically you get certification, you get stamps on your forehead saying grade A worker. And again, this is something where for one individual it pays very nicely. But if everyone gets a bunch of stamps on your forehead, this doesn't mean everyone can get a good job. It means that you need even more stamps to be considered worthy of an interview. Once you buy the idea that a lot of education is nothing that you're going to use again in the real world, and rather that you just need to do it in order to look better than other people. And as I say in the book, a lot of what's happened in recent decades has been severe credential inflation, which means that you need more education to get the very same job that your parents or grandparents had. Once you buy that idea, then it's natural to think, well, what could we do to cause credential deflation, to reduce the amount of education that you need to become a secretary or a waiter at a nice restaurant or whatever? And what I say there is, the obvious approach is to try to reduce the amount of education that people have, to spend less time encouraging people to get more school and instead try to tip the scales back and say, taxpayers don't want to fund people to study subjects that they're never actually going to use again in the real world. So, educational austerity is basically just saying that we're going to try to reduce the amount of education that we have. We're going to reduce government support. And if you think of education as teaching useful skills, this is scary. But if you think of it as mainly just leading to a lot of wasteful jumping through hoops, then it's a way of getting the number of hoops you have to jump through down back to a reasonable level. And then similarly for vocational education, I say that it just makes a lot of sense to redirect education towards actual practical job training. And again, not waiting until college to do it, but when kids are in high school or middle school, why not go and at least expose them to a bunch of viable occupations and provide them training for those, rather than making everyone study a foreign language they're never going to use, to learn Latin or French. Why not go, instead of making them learn trigonometry, at least give them the option of, we can learn about plumbing or learn to be an electrician.
What about income? Now, people with vocational training certainly earn less than those with college degrees, do they not?
Well, it does vary by the actual job. So if you're comparing plumbers to people with English degrees, then I'd say the plumbers are doing great by comparison. But on average, it's true that people who have more education do make more money. Again, sort of the heart of my book is to say why, right? Is it because they learn useful skills, in which case the critique really has a lot of teeth? On the other hand, is it because you've just jumped through more hoops than other people? In that case, I would say, well, for an individual, it might make a lot of sense to go and spend a lot of years in school, but it doesn't make a lot of sense for society to do it because, again, my story is the more education that other people have, the more you need to not have your application thrown away by employers before they even interview you. Meaning, it is very striking, how, even jobs that you would think of as non-college jobs, like, being a waiter in a nice restaurant or concierge at a hotel. These are jobs where in 1950, virtually no one with these jobs would have had a college degree, and now it's very common, right? And, I say the reason is that the more education people have, the more you need to impress employers, even if the education has nothing to do with the jobs. Educational expectations have risen up to an absurdly high level. And again, like from the point of view of employers, this is not stupid because when the college degrees are abundant, it makes sense to say, well, fine, we'll say that we are only going to interview if you have a college degree. But it's not the kind of thing it makes sense for taxpayers to encourage.
And a lot of students, once they graduate, they just have mounds and mounds of student loan debt is almost like a second mortgage on a house or something. It takes them forever to get through that. So finally, what do you think about the idea of free college tuition? Now, that idea won Bernie Sanders a lot of young supporters in his presidential campaign.
Yeah, so I think this is a terrible idea. But I agree that this would probably lead to a large increase in college enrollments and maybe even college graduation. But it would just amplify this problem we're already having of needing a college degree to get even a halfway decent job. And I say, it's time for us to look down at our feet and realize we're not getting very far with the spending that we're doing, and instead try to figure out a way to let people get decent jobs when they're 18 instead of waiting until they're 22 or 25 or 30.
When President Trump hosted the National College Football Champions, the Alabama Crimson Tide, at the White House, he said all their moments of hard work had paid off.
We're proud of the way you play. We're proud of the way you represent yourselves, your university, and your state. And that is a great, great state. I know, because I won it by 32 points.
And then team members presented the president with one of their jerseys. That's about all you saw from the mainstream media when they reported the event. But we at CBN News dug a little deeper. We came up with this. Shortly after the president's remarks, some players exchanged some words with the president. And then right on the spot, they prayed for him. Now, why would they do such a thing at the close of a White House ceremony, you may ask? It really should come as no surprise, because in the championship game against Georgia, the Crimson Tide quarterback was heard praising God and praying in tongues. Look, I'm not saying Alabama won the National College Football Championship this year because their quarterback prayed and spoke in tongues, but I don't think God really cares who wins a football game, do you? I do know he cares about each and every member of the team, and all of us. And he wants each of us to reach our fullest potential as we hopefully follow him and his purpose for our lives. But back to that prayer moment with the Alabama football team and the president. Isn't it refreshing to see young athletes or anyone praying for the president at the White House? When some evangelical leaders did the same thing last year, some people on social media and in the mainstream media were critical. One man tweeted, "What kind of voodoo mojo is this?" No mojo, no voodoo, just Americans praying for their president. At a time when the war in Syria has the potential of blowing up into a much bigger war, when Wall Street fears a trade war with China, and poison politics prevail in Washington. Don't you think it's a good thing when people pray for our president? In 1956, the United States adopted the national motto, "In God We Trust." Maybe we all should do a little more trusting of God these days. And especially now and always, let's pray for our president. It doesn't matter if you like him or not, if you voted for him or someone else. He is our president, and he could use some divine wisdom and guidance in these uncertain times. And we, as a nation, sure could use more of God's blessings, couldn't we? Well, that's it from the Global Lane this week. Follow us on Facebook, iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and Twitter. And until next time, be blessed.